Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Obrigado pela vossa presença. Acho que vamos ter uma sessão memorável neste ciclo Great Artists on Campus, que eu vos convido a acompanharem até final de maio. Hoje recebemos Francoise Vergès, a quem eu agradeço ter aceitado o nosso convite para estar em Lisboa. Ontem tivemos uma belíssima conversa na Galeria Quadrum, no âmbito da exposição Nampula, Macua, Socialismo, de Manuel Santos Maia. E hoje a Francoise Vergès oferece-nos uma conferência em nome próprio sobre uma questão central para o pensamento contemporâneo, a decolonização do museu. Eu vou só fazer uma brevíssima apresentação de Francoise Vergès pensando sobretudo na comunidade académica, nos mais jovens, e vou fazê-lo em português rapidamente. A conferência será em inglês e depois haverá um momento de Q&A, de perguntas e respostas, debate com a plateia. Acho que rapidamente a Francoise Vergès vai querer estabelecer diálogo convosco, foi o que me disse há instantes. Francoise Vergès é doutorada em Ciência Política pela Universidade da Califórnia, Berkeley. É uma das principais vozes do movimento antirracista e feminista, com um trabalho focado na intersecção entre psicologia e teoria pós-colonial. É cofundadora do coletivo Decolonize the Arts e da Universidade Livre Decolonizing the Museum. A Orfeu Negro publicou recentemente, mais ou menos recentemente, um feminismo decolonial e decolonizar o museu. São dois títulos fundamentais em português, editados graças à editora Orfeu Negro. A sessão está aberta. Francoise Vergès, thank you very much for being here, and the word is yours.
Good afternoon. Sorry, I will speak in English because I only know French, Creole, and English. Sorry, I don't speak Portuguese. So I will be speaking in English, yes, in English. So the title of the talk is Why the Model of the Western Museum Hegemonic and Why It Cannot Be Decolonized. I mean, I got interested in that because there is no movement of liberation, no social movement, feminist, queer, worker, which does not have a program of cultural and visual, transformation. All liberation movement of liberation really try to offer counter-image and counter-narrative to the colonial, text. And it was not for nothing that a lot of them, for instance, invited filmmakers, invited photographers to effectively testify from something else, right? Or the importance also of the image of the Vietnamese woman with guns, also to contest the question of the passive, Asian women. I mean, or effectively in Algeria or Mozambique or Angola. So this, and also we can talk about the women's liberation movement, but also the, gay movement. I mean, that importance for the question of image and counter-image and counter-narrative. So this is why I'm interested. I'm not I don't need to be a professional of a museum to talk about the museum. And I have been working on colonial slavery, on colonization and decolonization to this day. So effectively the importance of, and how museum being, of course, the incredible place where this has been, presented to the world. So there are two questions in my title, and I will start by answering the first. Why the model of the Western Museum hegemonic? Well, quite simply because it works. It works. I mean, it works. I mean, the museum it works. People go there. It has some success. It is associated with culture, high culture. The architecture is also familiar. Whether you have never been to a museum, usually that there's going to be a succession of rooms that you're going to follow right from one to the other. You know that you cannot scream, that you have to speak like that, to be quite polite. You know that there is a certain way of presenting yourself in a place, and if you work with your children, okay. So there is a way, I mean, we know, we have been disciplined, even though there have not been like a guide for that. But we know, that's been an education to when you art is look with silence and meditation. Even, the poor tourists today, they cannot even also, they have to remain silent. It's also because it become a must-see in tourist guide. It's very important now. It's part of the 10 things to see in a city. And because it is associated with high culture, beauty, and meditation. And finally, also because in recent decades, it become a commercial mall. A place to buy souvenir and bring, home some souvenir. It's very important also. It was born in 18th century Europe, especially in France, and I will talk about it. It was consolidated in the 19th century with post-slavery colonization, it has acquired, with the birth of UNESCO and ICOM in the second half of the 20th century, the status of an international institution that really matter for all humanity, and with international, importance, protection of heritage, notion of immaterial heritage, stronger laws against looting and trafficking, even though they are not really applied, but they matter, it's part of there are international meetings around the museum constantly. Its prestige reflects on the nation state. The more prestigious and universal its collection, the greater prestige, France is the Louvre, Spain is the Prado, London is the British Museum, Germany is the Humboldt Forum, and so on and so forth. The museum contributes to the national narrative, but also to the place of the nation within, in the world. How the nation see itself and see art, craft, natural history, and the place it gives to art also. It gives the nation state, an international status, and the idea that art is above everything else, even human life. Art is more important, even you have to save art, even before you save human life. So still, answering this question, the Western Universal Museum, it's in fact a strange place, because it's this place you walk through and you're going to find painting, object, furniture, statue, animals, rugs, fabric, boards, knives, swords, sometimes human remains, in their, skull, bones, hair, from several continents and several epochs in the same place. So it's quite, it's impressive. It's a reflection, as I say, of the national grandeur. This institution, when it was born in 18th century, remember, the century of the revolution, English Revolution, American Revolution, French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution also, but this is, put aside. And so it's the century when the principle of liberty and equality were affirmed against absolutism and tyranny. It was also the century in which the transatlantic slave trade reached, an unprecedented peak. As you may know, in 17th century, it was like 30 to 40,000 Africans were deported per year. In 18th century, we moved to 70 to 90,000 per year. So the century of the revolution is also the century of the most important slave trade in terms of number. And it was also a century during which bankers, answerers, shipbuilders, slaveholders, both male and female, ship captains, slave trader, plantation owner accrued considerable wealth and also wanted to show, to own their house. The slave plantation was at the center of a globalized economy that supplied the inhabitants of Europe with sugar, coffee, tobacco, spices, and other delight. All these goods radically transformed taste and social status, ways of living, of receiving guests, and of self-representation. It was a century that saw the consolidation of the ideal of whiteness as a concentrate of beauty, reason, and the principle of freedom. And effectively, deeply transformed social taste. It started the moment when you were offering, sweets and coffee to people coming, to your place. You did not do that before. When you start to see at the end of 17th century men smoking a pipe, that you will not see that in 15th or 16th century. So it entered the self-representation. Masculinity started to represent itself by smoking, And even when you look at the 19th century literature, men after the dinner go to the smoking place, and women, as usual, just do nothing and chat, whatever they do. So this is very, it really, and it's in fact also the first book, of a recipe of sweets, like dessert, appear at that moment. You did not have, because it was sweetened with honey before. So the sugar really transformed, really, and made French pastry, or, like this, incredible status. It was also the moment when something like, like effectively being married, where, you had a cake, a wedding cake. But at the beginning, sugar, for instance, was used for sculpture. And there was a moment for the Queen of England where you had a parade of things made in sugar, soldiers and everything, and an incredible parade. So the sugar was also that. It was a status of wealth, and in the house, aristocratic house, you have the box with the sugar, and the patriarch will open the box and distribute sugar as distributing really something extremely, precious. So incredible transformation of the taste of the. Also, we never think about, for instance, the sugar bowl, the teapot, the coffee pot. And when I do the visit in museum, I go to this room to show also, because before you did not have a coffee pot, or you did not have a teapot, and you did not have. And also it's interesting to see how the decoration sometime, representing sugar cane field. I mean, the exoticism also entering, in the house, in the house. But it was in the 19th century that the Universal Western Museum reached its full glory, when thousands of art objects and human remains were added to collection, given by soldiers, officers, missionaries, explorers, traders, and administrators in the wake of imperial war and colonization. This object enriched galleries, bestowing on the institution an indispensable status. And it became impossible to rival, the sheer range of collection hailing from Asia, Africa, the Americas, Oceania, Europe, and the Caribbean. And this gives the Western Museum that status that you will never find in the Global South, even if you find incredible museum in the Global South. You will never. That was a moment of incredible bringing, all the looted or dishonestly acquired. Making the conflictual and criminal aspect of its story and presented itself as a depository of the universal, a guardian of all humanity heritage, a place to cherish, to be protected and preserved from any contestation, a sanctified space far from the disorder of the world. The museum neutrality was taken for granted. Inside, tones are hushed, dialogue disinterested, spare excess and intemperance. And even when you have strike by staff or protest or occupation of museum, it's really seen quite distasteful. You don't do that. You don't do that in a museum. You can occupy the university, but not the museum. Le Louvre showed best the birth of the Universal Museum, rather even than the British Museum or any other prestigious museum of the 18th century. And in fact, many European national museums were created in the 19th century. The Prado was 19th century and other. So why Le Louvre, and why for me it was Le Louvre that interested me? Because the collection in Le Louvre ran from 1793 to 1848, a very important date in the French colonial slavery. 1983, the first abolition of slavery in Saint-Domingue, future Haiti, and 1848 is a final abolition of slavery in the French colony, because in between Napoleon has restituted Europeans to slavery in 1804. So France has two abolitions of slavery. Because also the origin of the Louvre are impeccable. Like there is no other museum that have, these parents. It's a child of the French Revolution and of the French Enlightenment. No other museum can have this, parentage. It was also a true revolutionary gesture that that opened, that Le Louvre as a public museum. Before that, you had private places, aristocrat could have incredible collection, or the cabinet, the curiosity, but not a public space for the people. So it was a true revolutionary gesture, because the French Revolutionary decided to return to the people, to the French people, the art that the aristocracy, the church, and the monarchy had accumulated upon the explanation of the people. So they said to the people, this is yours, in fact, because it was seized without compensation. So that was quite revolutionary, right? No, you don't have anything to say, we take it. Yet its real prestige was built upon the vast treasure and theft that was carried out in the name of revolution, in the name of freedom, which distinguish it from other universal museums. You know, they still, but not in the name of freedom, you know, in the name of protecting things, because these people, these savage people, don't know how to protect their treasure, but that was in the name of freedom. The author of one of the first catalogue of the Louvre collection wrote that the French National Assembly, so during the Revolution, was breaking, I quote, the chain that held the art captive. The revolutionary declared before the Legislative Assembly that, and I quote, by destroying the idea of royalty, the museum will conserve masterpiece in the detestable palace of your ci-devant king, so you will take them, suggesting that France's conservation of art objects played a role in the destruction of monarchy. Revolutionary army were asked, really by the parliament, to seize art, archive, and documents throughout Europe, living under the tyrants and the monarch. The argument of freeing art from tyranny was fundamental for what was to come. It was France's duty, as the land of liberty, in a world subjected to tyranny, to free artwork from captivity. Seizing was freeing. The slavery metaphor would be widely used to justify the expropriation of knowledge and object. France had to protect them from the avid, selfish hand of tyrant and monarch and enslaver who illegally enjoyed their beauty. Seizure was justified in the name of freedom, and France embodying freedom for all humankind, it was just and natural that its army seized art, books, archive, and document from country. The creator of the Universal Museum erased a key part of the history of the accumulation of capital. The theft and seizure by the Revolutionary Army, then the massive seizure order by Napoleon, made in Belgium, the Netherlands, Prussia, Austria, Germany, Italy, Egypt, and Spain, gave the museum an incomparable stature in Europe. By turning artwork into spoil of war in the name of the revolutionary and republican principle, Republican and Napoleonic France opened the path to universal, national, and modern museum. So the fall of the empire when Napoleon, you know, like, because they took really, I mean, it was really the moment with Napoleon. For instance, Napoleon in Italy took everything. You know, Florence was practically emptied of all his art. You know, Milan, in Rome, and I mean, there was like caravan of things. You know, going through the Alps and arriving, and there are a lithography of that going through Paris, like ton and ton of carriage, you know, bringing, you know, not only statue and painting, but also animals, plants, archive, documents, everything was taken. And it was also the first time in the modern history that the end of like war was a sign against giving art, right? Peace was, okay, you give us art. And that was, so it was not, you know, before, because looting art has always been, you know, the spoil of war. But that was really now named and done by a republic. So it was not. So as I said, the fall of the empire changed little, as I quote, the spectacular impression of universalism that constituted the golden age of the Louvre so marked minds that it inaugurated a new way of conserving, exhibiting, and admitting art in the different European countries. Little by little, the idea of vast museum of a universalist conception spread and opened the path to the creation of those that we know today, a former director of the Louvre has written. Le Louvre offered the 19th century visitor an unprecedented panorama. You know, Napoleon died in the 19th century. In a day, they could contemplate Europe's most admired painting, alongside artifacts from Egypt, you know, Greek antiquity, Roman Empire, Islamic world, and so on. The model had its strengths, and the European state hurried to imitate it, and in turn to assemble national collections that reflected also their prestige. The constitution of the Louvre collection in the late 18th to the 19th century made it the museum that all the European state wanted to imitate, gradually becoming the hegemonic model of the Universal Museum, closely followed by the major capital of Europe. Even, you know, English, who were like the greater enemy of Napoleon, admire the Louvre. You know, they say, oh, this is I mean, this guy is terrible, and it's, you know, we have to send it to Saint Helene, but what he has done is quite admirable. So the model was fully embraced by post-slavery colonization. Settlers, soldiers, missionary, merchant, explorer, and sailors seized and robbed Africa, the Americas, the Pacific, and Asia. European museums were filled with looted objects from Beijing, Delhi, Angkor, Antananarivo, and Benin City. They grew rich from the destruction and systematic theft of the palace treasure of the African, Asian, and Malagasy kingdom and empire. Judging by the sheer extent of the seizure in Africa, it is as if nothing were to remain on a continent that the Europeans nonetheless said had no history and no art. And I quote, the racist and colonialist vision of an entire continent, as African historian Joseph Kizerbo wrote, facilitated trafficking and the creation of a market. Art objects were put on the same level as rubber or groundnuts, that of a raw material to be extracted and exploited and brought back to Europe. A little word on the object of the museum, what we call the object of the museum. At the beginning of the 1953 film, The Statue Also Die, commissioned by Senegalese intellectual Alioune Diop, who was the founder also of Présence Africaine edition and journal in 1947, and which was realized by Alain René and Chris Marker and released in 1953, but was forbidden for 10 years in France. You could not see it, for 10 years. We hear this, and I quote, when men are dead, they enter history. When statues are dead, they enter art. This botany of death is what we call culture. A botany of death, indeed. To enter the museum, the object must be torn from its environment. Spiritual and political symbol must die to become art objects in the museum. Effigies, relics, weapons, banners, scepter, bowl, cups, rugs, jewels, furniture, toys, mummy become object. This object, artifact, things that were inscribed into a social web of transaction that belong to an affective, cultural, social world, that were made by someone, offered, cherished, buried, thrown up or destroyed after use, given to friend, to lover, to children, given to king and queen as diplomatic gift, are now alone. That goddess will never again be offered flowers, that mask will never again be worn, that toy will never again be used in a game, that cup will never again hold food. And we know that we'll never be praying in front of a saint. To the French revolutionary who invented the Universal Museum, secularizing object was fundamental. It was part also of this idea, of the French Revolution, of effectively that secularization is important, of course, to attack the power of the church. It was a foundation of European modernity, of a desacralized education. Kings and queens had weaponized the divine to justify their absolute power. The Universal Museum will be a place of regeneration and education for the citizen of the Republic. Thus, the object had to be separated from any relation with tradition and religion, or from the usual and the mundane, and enter the realm of contemplation. That revolutionary gesture would help the citizenry to contemplate religious art object with a secular eye. So they were no longer. In 19th century also, the principle of exhaustivity became hegemonic. A museum will not receive 100 butterfly or masks, but hundreds of thousands of them. Not a dozen of arrows or shield, but thousands of them. Between 1800 and 1960s, because, in fact, the looting of the African continent lasted long after independence, it did not stop with independence. The African continent was emptied of 19% of its art. And when you think about the object, that, for instance, in Denmark, the museum collection of cultural and historical museum are, 4.2 million objects. It's huge, for a small country. In France, you have 80.6 million objects in the, 61 national museums. It's not a lot, 61 national museums and like 80 million objects. And, there are 8 million objects in the British Museum alone, or 120,000 in the Tervuren Museum, which is called now the Africa Museum, or 500,000 in the Humboldt Museum. So an incredible accumulation, museum in the West are bank. they rest also an incredible value. These are value. It's not because when we say object, it's as if they are not value, but it's incredible capital which is accumulated in a museum. In a museum where, selling its collection, they would be an incredible wealth, with what they have now. It's incredible. And so sometimes we forget, we talk about the museum as if the museum is not within a political economy, has no economy. But it has economy, and all the things, for instance, when something is given, there is a value accrued to that. There is really, so it's very important to look at the political economy of a museum. Who give the money, with the budget, but also what represent the collection in terms of, capital. If National Museum of the Global South may also have impressive collection, they never pretend to be universal. They cannot pretend to be universal. They narrate a national history with its own problems. So, for instance, their minority can be erased, and history, that there is a nation. But nonetheless, they are not universal. The National Museum of Peru may have over 500,000 artifacts, but none of them come from Greece or Finland. The National Museum in Nigeria holds 47,000 objects, and none come from Switzerland or Portugal. There are no Greek statues in the Museum of Lagos, or Bavarian folkloric clothes in the museum in Seoul. So that's also a very incredible difference into what is. So even though you have important museums in the Global South, they cannot be universal. So that's another story. The model of the Universal Museum is hegemonic, effectively. It is emulated all around the world. It has to be today, big, impressive building with gentrification, prestigious collection, or touristic attraction. And this was the model of the Guggenheim Bilbao. It worked so well that everyone wanted to follow that after the gentrification of Bilbao, which was a working class city. But the disparity between the global north and global south are not just the one I just, talk about. There are other inequality, and also out of the 104,000 museum in 2021, 61% are in the north, right, in Western Europe and North America. United States alone, has 1/3 practically of all institutions, and Western Europe and Canada, the rest of it. 18% are in Asia Pacific, 11% in Eastern Europe, 8% in South America and the Caribbean, 0.8% in Africa, 0.7% in the Arab state. Africa and the small island developing states represent only 1.5% of the total number of the museums in the world. The dramatic rise in cultural tourism in recent decades had led nonetheless to increase of number of museums around the world, and some museums are built, for a specific event, like for the Museum of Tomorrow in Rio for the Olympic Games in Brazil at the time, or, we could also quote. But nonetheless, this remains, the power is in the north. Again, because the accumulation of, as I say, in 18th and 19th century, that nobody can, can rival today, there's not. So you will have contemporary art museum, quite important in China, Taiwan, or other places, but they will not have this museum anymore. There will be no universal museum. And even in the art, then we enter the question of the market. That's already, something else we can talk about. And so that's the inequality on the global level, but even within in a country, you will have, incredible difference. Not museums are equal. The museum usually in the capital will drain all, the budget and the, the interest. And a small museum in small cities will be abandoned. So that's, that's the question, the museum. But also when we talk about the museum today, we have to talk about climate disaster, because a lot of museums are not prepared for that. The growing financialization of art, austerities policy, increased disparity, racism, and late fascism also, that we will talk about. So in terms of, what is the museum also confronting today, I want to say that there cannot be a conversation about museum today, without mentioning what's happening in Gaza and the systematic destruction of its museum, its historical and archaeological site. According to the Palestinian Ministry of Culture, as of February 24, 2024, so a year ago, more than a year ago, 207 archaeological sites, buildings of cultural and historical significance, out of a total of 320, had been reduced to rubble. And this include very old, mosques, churches, cemetery, museum, and so on. Some of them, from 11th century or whatever. And that we can say that because colonial occupation is not only about massacre, genocide, land dispossession, extraction and exploitation, the renaming of rivers, mountains, and cities, but also the destruction of temples, palaces, cities, and monuments, the looting of art, archive, and document. Erasing the past, appropriating the art and land of the colonized has always occupied an important role in colonization. Looting was another symbol of humiliation and domination. The colonial army organized public ceremony during which leaders, who had fight against the colonial army, had to surrender their weapon and everything that symbolized their social and political status. The latter was appropriated by trafficked by officers who sell them to the higher bidder, but it was also about making profit and by scattering the booty, making it difficult to identify them today. And the current conversation, but also the current conversation about restitution and return should include current looting and destruction. This is not what the 19th century, in the 21st century as well. And we can talk about Congo, but also Sudan, where the National Museum in Khartoum was looted, in December last December, entirely looted, and apparently objects are already being trafficked, but in the dark web, And of course, we can talk about what's happened in Congo, but also what happened, in Iraq with the invasion, U.S. invasion, Afghanistan, Syria, Kashmir, and also Ukraine. Yet, there was no global condemnation of the destruction of Palestinian museum and historical site, as there was when the Taliban destroyed the Buddha of Bamyan in March 2001. Rather silence to moderated concern from the world of Universal Museum. And on the contrary, since the start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, museums have benefited from the implementation of urgent repair, protection, and digitization measures, which is at the heart of the UNESCO assistance program, implemented in close cooperation with the organization international partner. My point is not that Ukraine museum and historical sites should not be protected, but the reason of an inequality demonstrated though by the quick response to the invasion of Ukraine and the no response in Palestine, Iraq, or Sudan today. I would even like further to suggest that if destroying and looting art belong to the long history of war and conquest, not just those waged by the West, what distinguished art looting in colonial and imperialist war is that extermination goes with conservation. Indeed, if colonial Europeans were certainly not the first to exterminate a species or a people, they were the first to invest so much in preserving a trace of what they had exterminated. What was exterminated found its way into the museum. For instance, we know that during the Herero genocide by German troops, women in concentration camp were forced to scrap the flesh of the skull of their loved one with pieces of glass so that the skull will be sent to museum. Several today are at the Met in New York. One can find traces of exterminated people, non-human species, and plants in Western Museum. Effectively, as I say quite often, if you want to see, image of indigenous people exterminated by colonial conquest, you can go to the museum and you will see painting of them, or diorama. Or, even species like birds, although you will go to a museum and you will find them, Or even, some wood, some precious wood. And there is a beautiful cabinet of 19th century France, for instance, at the Met in ebony, And you reread the following text that absolutely erase, anything of, the history of extraction and violence. And I read the text. Largely veneered with lustrous ebony, the architectural piece bears eloquent testimony to the importance to the European economy of overseas trade. In the 17th century, for the first time, tropical timber and other exotic material became available in quantity to European cabinet makers who prosper, as they said, new fashion in furniture. You know, like totally, you know, like this happened like that. Apparently, ebony arrived, you know, by a boat like that, you know, get on a boat and arrive in a port. Beautifully carved door from destroyed African palace, statue of god and goddess, stone of Amtapar in Greece, South Asia or East Asia. You can go to the museum. It raises the question of the need for conservation and this question of conserving, you know, like taking away to present it, you know. It not only stands as a trace of colonial extermination and predation, but as a scientific project for present and future discovery. For instance, the study of corpses of enslaved led to understand what they ate, how much they were starved, and how punishment can be read on their bone. So this, in the name of science, effectively a lot of these objects are kept in museums. So this, it was the question, you know, of what is conservation and what should be still, you know, if that science should be, you know, kept as it is. So the second question, why can it not be decolonized? When I say that, you know, that, they are usually protests, you know, but what about this artist's work, this show, you know, the effort by this or that museum, this work of this curator, you know, why do I dismiss this? I want to say, you know, like right away that I do not dismiss this effort and production. They are inscribed, you know, for me in the history of anti-colonial production, you know, from not starting, you know, in the 60s, but long way back, of knowledge, you know, of colonized, never stopped to write and create. You know, the enslaved left texts, you know, in the US and UK, but or artistic creation, you know, of poems, songs, and narrative. Then, you know, you have in the 60s all this movement, like the 1969 Festival of Alger, you had the creation of FESPACO in Bamako, the festival in Dakar, in La Havana, you know. All this event, effort and creation and production provided other imaginary, another form of representation. And since then, and also you have another moment, if you want to look at it, you know, a long moment, and since the 1980s, we'll say, in the university or, you know, other places, you had effectively a transformation of the discipline of history, philosophy, anthropology, science, and many other. Transform, you know, knowledge, question being posed, you know, teaching, you know, transform. Grounded also in anti-colonial production of film, literature, political, you know, theory, Black Marxism, Black indigenous and Islamic feminism, you know, of leaders, writers, and artists. There never was an absence. So this is, you know, what's happening. So I look at this as in this long history. But the work of decolonization, so that's very important for me, you know, very important. But the work of decolonization is not done. There have been no abolition of structural racism, no abolition of racial capitalism and imperialism. So can a museum be enclave, separated from the environment? You know, can a museum be like decolonized enclave, like institution, and all around you will have anti-migrant policies, you have, you know, like racism, you know, Islamophobia, you know. So we have also to see why these things, a museum can be decolonized, even, you know, around is not being decolonized. And also perhaps we can also say that the progress is very fragile. We are witnessing the assault on university today in the US, UK, Germany, France, and in other places, and on cultural and art institutions, the criminalization of pro-Palestine artists in the West. But also this is happening not in the West, it is also happening in India, in Turkey, in Hungary, and other places, you know. There is a context of, you know, of fascistic forces who want to transform also what is being shown, you know. So public institutions are under assault, but few have engaged, you know, in offensive response. Private institutions are another matter. So to clarify, you know, and finish like that, fight for social, racial, and gender justice are absolutely fundamental, but also with other, you know, action to imagine and create different institutions today. You know, we know enough after all these years of feminist studies, visual studies, queer studies, and cinema, and so on, to know that things can be, you know, transformed, and there is no just way of transformation. But I'm sorry, I'm losing my page. Well, so And also coming from Reunion Island, whose decolonization has not, happened yet, having been educated by anti-colonial parents and witnessing how decolonization is yet to be, achieved, I take also decolonization to be a very serious matter, a long and difficult process. People have died for it and are still dying for it. Decolonization is not a metaphor, as Eve Tusk and Wen Young wrote in 2012. Abolishing settler colonialism as enemy, we will do everything to stop the process. And this is why I pick up, a phrase of Frantz Fanon for, the title of the book on the museum. In The Rush of the Hearse, Frantz Fanon wrote, and I quote, "Decolonization we set up out to change the order of the world is obviously a program of absolute disorder. But it cannot come as a result of magical practices, nor a natural shock, not a friendly understanding. Decolonization, as we know, is a historical process. That is to say that it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible nor clear to itself, except in the exact measure that we can discern the movement which gives it historical form and content. So it's as we do decolonization that decolonization is being done, and we understand. So again, an institution cannot be decolonized if the society around is not decolonized. Reform must be made in the way in which the collection is presented, but it will not be decolonization. And also, for me, the museum is a total social institution. It's not just about what you have on the wall. Do you have like 50 women, 50% men, and within the men and the women you have pay attention to have, all the diversity and inclusivity. No, it's also, was it built by whom? Migrant worker, underpaid, did you have gentrification? By whom is it maintained and cleaned? Well, how much are paid the cleaner? Who are they? Like usually black people and guide also, underpaid worker. What are the source of funding with the growing role of billionaire donator who can pressure public institutions doing this and that? The salary and status of everyone working there, the curriculum of the curator, of the art historian. The museum, again, is not a neutral space. Its racial, social, and gender structure of inequality intersect. And we have seen, in recent strike in different institutions for better condition and for social and racial justice, that suddenly you see that is a social institution. You suddenly hear that you have people who are totally underpaid and totally exploited, So behind, like the beauty of what we saw suddenly. The museum cannot be studied without looking at its role and place in the political economy of capitalism, imperialism, and ethno-nationalism. Public museum and private museum are, is another matter, have been attacked also for the complicity with corporation, the arm industry, colonial occupation, structural racism, corruption, and white supremacy. As we saw, for instance, in the Whitney Museum when there was a lot of protests against, there was on the board meeting someone who was doing weapons, arms, and they say, you cannot have that. So again, I say that if we want to talk about the museum and the decolonization, we have to ask who cleans, who guards, who cooks, who does all the minor tasks that must be done, but are barely acknowledged, so that a show on radical feminism or climate disaster or a forgotten figure of the art can be produced. What kind of art history curating curriculum has the professional followed? Why is the salary of the cleaner barely a quarter of the curator, with none of the recognition that the curator has? Who has calculated their worth, their social value, and thus their place in a social, racial, and gender hierarchy? So, but even the demand for justice that are, like quite timid in a way, right? Okay, but they are not timid, are met with incredible resistance by major Western museums, which repeatedly reaffirm their neutral universalism. After the action in October 2022 at the National Gallery, when the two young women threw soup at the Gauguin, nearly 100 representatives of major Western museums expressed their disapproval. And they wrote, and I quote, "Museums are places where people from a wide variety of backgrounds can engage in dialogue and will therefore enable social discourse. In this sense, the core tasks of the museum as an institution, collecting, researching, sharing, and preserving, are no more relevant than ever." End of quote. But as Ariela Aisha Azoulay has written, the museum, and I quote, is a technology and institution inseparable from the settler colonial state, the system of border and police, and it operates through the category of art assumed as private property. So if that decolonization is impossible, what to do with the Louvre, the British Museum, and other, I, as I say, continue to fight for social, racial, and gender justice against sexual and racial violence and for restitution. But the heavy burden of transforming them should not be put on the shoulder of those whose ancestors were looted or those who are totally exploited, racially exploited today. Demand for restitution should be, listened to, but it's not up to these people to do the work, But also I think that the energy should be invested into imagining what I call a post-museum. What will be the architecture, the function, the policy of conservation, preservation, the objective, the role confronting, climate disaster and fascism. How do we imagine, another institution today and to include climate disaster in the conversation? Now we have to recognize that the Western institution has understood this must change and is finding a way to do this, without dismantling the institution, but nonetheless, doing, new show, new way of writing. This is absolutely important. This is incredibly, we see more and more of this show coming everywhere, And of course, and they say we have to give voice to every side, and listen to everyone. But the argument of historical complexity and the idea of itinerant object do not suffice to resolve the contradiction. Of course, history is complex. Colonialism was never totally uniform from one land to the next. There were encounter, exchange, zone of contact, alliance, betrayal, and circulation, right? But none of this justify refusing demand for dignity, freedom, and reparation. It is not because a thief has taken care of the object he stole from me that I have to let him keep it. When the African-American poet Jane Cortez declared, and I quote, "The museum wants our art, our culture, our visitor demographic, but not our people," she captured what is at play in this gesture of making change so that nothing change. So there was something I wanted to say about the project of the museum without object in Réunion, but I think it's a little perhaps too long, so we can talk about it in the question and answer. Perhaps I will talk just about a project I'm doing now with University of London Institute in Paris, and it's imagining the post-museum. And so when the first meeting we had, and I say, okay, how can we describe the Universal Museum, Western Museum? There was like pages and pages, exploitation, extraction, and so on and so forth. And I say, okay, but what will be a decolonial museum? And there was, it will be non-binary. I say, how do you translate that in space? Okay. Or it will be, will it be inclusive? Okay, sure, but what does it mean concretely? Or it will be not vertical but horizontal. Okay, fine, but what is a space of non-horizontal thinking? I have not seen it. I don't know it because effectively everything. So that effort of imagination of the space became very important. And the next, the workshop I will have at the end of April in London will be with architects, and to effectively to try to offer a prototype of that structure. So not just to talk about it will be like that, it will be like that, but what is a prototype? And the prototype is being thought in the current context of police surveillance, of the public space being more and more restrained to you cannot stand in a street for more than 1 hour. If you are 20 of you, the police will start to come. What are you doing? Especially if you are young black or young Arab, then certainly you will not even stay 1 hour. So in that context also more precariousness because of the less money available, less public money, or program of austerity, all this rhetoric. How to invent something that will be mobile and very, not heavy to carry around and could be deployed and fall back and run, when there is the moment to run, and that will be that one object, but the replica, and then you draw, from that story, and you talk about it, or, for instance, an image. And so the question of this construction of this and unlearning to learn, and re-educating our gaze, because, for me, we are taught by school and by the media and by power not to see what is under our eyes. We don't see it. I'm just going to give you an example. I was invited to do something at the museum about Napoleon, which is near Paris, at Ruelle Malmaison. This is where Napoleon and Josephine lived. Anyway, so I visited, with the staff before I did the project. They show me the places. So this is Napoleon, with a lot of eagles in gold. It's absolutely ugly furniture. But anyway, this is Napoleon. So, but we went to the last, floor, and they reconstituted the room in which he lived in Sainte-Hélène, in exile. So the little bed where he slept and so on. And the narrative is about how the British were mean. This was a great man, and nonetheless, and he died by himself. And then I look at the room and at the bedroom, and I notice a lot of Chinese furniture, and I say, why do we have Chinese furniture in Sainte-Hélène? This totally island, totally lost in the Atlantic Ocean. And then I have never read that Napoleon had a taste for Chinese furniture. And they say, we don't know. And this has been recreated years ago, right? And so they did not see. It was obvious that this was Chinese furniture, Chinese chair and so on. And it was part of the thing, but they did not ask themselves, why is that? So I went home and started to look, what do you have Chinese, what is that? And so I read that effectively the British had brought Chinese as indenture workers to the island of Sainte-Hélène to make their work, and also Malagasy enslaved also too. And so by taking also Chinese with them, from mostly the south of China, that brought also some furniture, which they put in Napoleon bedroom. So there was a story that was connected with imperial, UK and the story of imperialism and transportation of people from China to Sainte-Hélène, and enslaved. And this was totally so, and it was there. It was a big, it was not like a small little thing, in a corner. No, it was a big paramount. And so it was interesting to see that it's not seen, because the story was Napoleon exile and the meanness of the British, but not the surrounding. What was the environment? What was Sainte-Hélène at the time? What was the British doing that? Why did you have Malagasy enslaved and Chinese indenture worker? What was the story? And then, of course, the irony of having this racist Napoleon dying surrounded by Chinese and Malagasy, black Malagasy, I thought was quite ironic, was also quite a fact that could be, also being told. So it's the thing that is there, and you see it. It's not that you don't see it. Of course, they have seen that, but you don't make anything out of it. You don't. And things are naturalized. So they're there, but where? So it's also that, for me, the post-museum to retrain our senses, not, of course, the gaze, but also everything else. And to nourish curiosity, because for me also education is about, if some of you have kids, I don't, but I have seen, it's like, why is that? Why is that? Why is that? Why you explain to me? And at one point you hear, stop asking questions. And the school is like no asking question anymore, because you have to remain. And we are trained to be silent for I don't know how many years. But it's quite long. It's quite long, right? And so we are trained, our body also are trained to sit quietly, silently for hours, listening to whatever. And so it's like that, but we have to. And so that teaching is also, like our senses become like mutilated or, kind of not. And so how that post-museum can also, make us alive again with all our senses, the touch, the smell, the hear, and so that for me will be that. So that project, so the London thing will be to build the prototype, to really also go to the concrete translation of an idea, and not just, it should be like that, it should be like that, but to confront the making of that, and perhaps not being able to do it, perhaps being with our incapacity, but that will teach us something. We will not remain in the realm of, wishful thinking. And then the Paris workshop will be about then in that structure that perhaps will be, imagine what could be done inside, like effectively in what this very short moment of like kind of protest things, connected also with, we are with a friend, artist friend from Ghana today, and she did a mobile museum through Ghana. But I was thinking also what Ziga Vertov did during the revolution with the cinema and showing. So this kind of like movement also of triggering, some collective thing with something that is being created at the moment and on the moment. So I think that's it, no? Okay.
Thank you very much, Francoise Vergès, for this great lecture. Now the dialogue can open with Francoise Vergès. There is a microphone, 2 microphones that can circulate. There is no assistance in the room, so let's be autonomous and hand on hand, we pass the microphone, okay? Who wants to start?
Salut, merci. I have 2 questions. One is, how do you think about the performing arts institutions that go for several centuries now hand in hand with the museum? So theater houses and opera houses, and the decolonization that affects both not only the objects, the life of objects, but also the art, the performing arts. And the other question is, what do you think about Mati Diop's recent movie, Dahomey, that I believe it's a good pairing to Chris Marker's movie you mentioned? Thank you.
Do I answer to each question, or do we wait for having many questions? 1 hour. So your first question is what do I think about performing art institution?
Because
what do you mean by decolonization? First, so I understand.
Because theater, opera, music, they undergo the same. They respond to the same ideological principles, and they operate it. Even the appropriation is not as clear because we are not talking about the expropriation of cultural objects or even practices, even though we could talk about the appropriation of cultural practices. But I'm even thinking of, there is a cultural and linguistic hegemony, you say it like that in English? Hegemony, over the other cultural practices. And you have also the portrait of different cultures in a very racist way, which is some stage directors try to. You understand?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
I do. Well, I will say, it depends what which place we are talking about. If we talk about the West, the West, most of the institutions rest on extraction and appropriation. But within even Europe, you have also less museum, because a museum is really like a solid institution, very connected to the state, to the prestige of the state. In theater, you have people who could escape that and present different spectacle and forms. So I will, the living art have been much more capable of offering some art, working with some, and people working in prison with prisoner in Italy, or elsewhere, or with migrant, or revisiting some classic tragedy and doing with echo with today current context. So I will not put theater in the same way. Even of course, you have the big institution, you know, like the National Theatre, and they may effectively be more rigid. But otherwise, I never had the same relation really at the point to the prestige of the nation state. I don't know if I will call it decolonization necessarily, but effectively working with forms, you know, working with new possibility, and through that, effectively opening imagination, which is part of the process of decolonization. But what I mean is, like, for me, we have to keep in mind that decolonization is a process, is not attained, is not reached. You know, perhaps one day when the world will no longer, you know, be under, you know, oppression and difference, but it contributes to that process. The way effectively anti-colonial also theory or anti-colonial texts, you know, or cinema, whatever, contribute to different. Suddenly we started to see African cinema, you know, and say, oh my God, okay, they tell story, and either it's like what we call universal story, but love story, but also, so it's all this has been happening for, you know, like, as soon as you had colonization, you had resistance, and you had cultural resistance and artistic resistance. You do have, it never stopped. So even sometime when you talk about looted art, we have to be careful not to think that because of that, creativity stopped in Africa. It continues. People continue to create. You know, they want to go on. And even, for instance, there is an incredible capacity in Africa to even recreate what is in museum, Western Museum. You know, the Benin bronze, they can do also that. But then the way in which the museum, and as I said, the question of capital in the Museum of Wealth accumulation, has made this like they worth nothing. Whereas the one in the museum has incredible value. Why? Why finally? Because these are African, what they are doing today. They are capable of doing, you know, this. So we have also to be careful not also to give more value to what is in the museum because it's authentic, you know, and in fact, this can be done. And that, I say that, but that can be applied to the Americas or the Caribbean, the continue, you know, that it continue to create. And even, so that one thing. Mati Diop Dahomey, I'm not sure I will put it on the same philosophy or, you know, or objective of the Alain René, Chris Marker, and I never want to forget Alioune Diop project. Because it was really not only about, it was not about return really. It was about effectively, and it was done in the 50s in France. The incredible, you know, like effectively the statue were valued, but in the meantime, the black people in France were not, you know, did not exist, and you had racism. So it's a little different. And it was not so much, I mean, although you had demand for return as soon as country became independent, as soon as the 60s, it was the first demand for return, and it was totally ignored. But I think in the Alioune Diop idea was also a critique of the museum, you know, because when they say the botany of death, you know, that they die when they enter. So it was not the idea of like bringing them to another kind of to another museum, African museum. It was like they die, you know, that they should remain in their social environment, cultural environment. They should not be taken from their environment.
Thank you very much for your brilliant presentation. I was curious to know if you think there's still something worth holding on to the idea of the universal. And I'm thinking, and I've been reading Souleymane Bachir Diagne, and I was wondering if you stand in opposition of his idea of the singularities within the universal, or if we should, for good, just leave aside the universal. And then I thought there's also this quite interesting irony of a Lebanese Paris-based artist that is now, or has now been commissioned to do the renovation of the British Museum, which epitomizes the most like universal museum of them all. So just bringing these two
for
ideas.
The British Museum, what?
Line Gottme for the wing of the
Yeah.
British Museum.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, something to hold on the universal. Yeah, why not? But it's like it's something. It's such a Western debate, you know. It's like, okay, we have to that the universal is very important, but how do you leave it? You know, how is it? You know, because the West is not really universal. You know, apparently, you know, like a lot of people do not deserve to live, you know, in their view, right? So if universal was really an idea by which you practice then you will not have all these wars and extraction. You know, there is a deep contradiction between the constant claim for universalism and the fact that there are so many lives that do not matter. So many lives that do not matter. That even childhood is not a universal notion. Some children deserve to have a childhood, and many, many other children do not even deserve to have a childhood, right? They can be killed, they can be criminalized. They will not have the good education. They will have not toys. They will not have, you know, love, whatever. So, universalism should be a lived idea, not just a notion through which the West is constantly reclaiming its, you know, superiority. It's an empty word. It's a rhetorical word. If you say that universalism is about the fact that we are all equal, and all human life deserve to be lived in dignity and equality, we are far from that. So it's sometimes for me, it's kind of like a empty, you know, like kind of like men talking, you know, to each other. And meantime, a lot of people are dying, you know. And the British Museum, sorry. Well, a lot of museums are doing things, I say. You know, it's time, you know, it's really it's a lot of diversity and inclusivity. I don't know how long it will last with the other one who is against diversity and inclusivity. But they do what they do. But as I say, I don't think a lot of us, when I say us, it's not just, you know, the non-white, whatever, but people interested in the question of liberation and you know, doing something else, building another kind of world than the one we are living in, is really about imagining the institution of tomorrow, or of today, in fact. And there have been two, you know, I mean, we know too much about all these institutions to continue to hold on them as if we're going to save them, you know, from, in fact, something that is within the construction itself, you know, that you cannot save, you know. It's part of a, they will be there, this museum. They are there, and they're going to survive. But my task, I mean, the one that I'm interested is like really imagining something else. Considering all the things that have been written and everything that is being done all over the world, but all over the world, I'm not just talking about the global south, to imagine different ways of living with non-human species as well. Joel?
Hello. Thank you. I would like to ask you if you have anything to say about the Portuguese reality, which is a little bit different in my view, because the last 20 years our museums got weaker. Our institutions, instead of getting richer in knowledge, have been getting weaker. The teams that should be working there with the different capacities have been emptied. So these discussions, our museums don't really reflect the intensity and the importance of these discussions. In a way, we should be we are not going against the strong institutions like the Louvre of the British Museum, unfortunately, because we would love to have a Louvre in every corner, because this is a Portuguese expression to say we have okay. But it's a big problem. because even the Ethnology Museum that should be showing the collections, that is one of the most important collections. Most of our, in my view, this is my view, our colonial collections has been silenced to storage. Most of the institutions don't have a permanent collection that shows the history of the country. And even now that we have, for the last year or so, a different government, the government has moved to a new central building. Now in the main entrance there is a sculpture with this with the same symbol of the globalization as the Portuguese would like to show themselves 50 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And it has been a silence happening, or whatever that is, that this sculpture certainly appeared there as if it was a spaceship that came to colonize our minds in a way. So again, so it's our situation is a little bit different. So what can you share with us?
Well, you know,
about
I
Portuguese
underline the
reality?
incredible asymmetry within a country or within a continent. So British Museum or the Louvre or Prado or the Met or, you know, different museums are absolutely draining all the money and energy and preeminence and importance. And even in France, you have museums that are totally abandoned and neglected within. So again, the economy of the museum is also important. You know, like when I say the economy, who invest in it? Why is that? You know, France has chosen very clearly the Louvre, right? And certainly not a lot of other museums that are really suffering from also budget restriction and things like that, particularly now with the new austerity program. That's one thing. Second, the way Europe was constructed and imagined was Western Europe, Northern Western Europe. Not, I mean, the south of Europe. I mean, of course, Italy, because of the Renaissance, was saved, you know, or Greece because of antiquity. But that was their moment, you know, and Portugal is totally marginalized in the European imagination or in the representation. Yeah. And became this, you know, totally country where you could go for vacation for cheap.
Sardines.
Yeah, and also that the people who send, you know, they are people to become, to work in France or elsewhere. So within the way even Europe was constructed, there was an incredible inequality. Even today, the way Europe is imagined is totally, you know, it's France, Germany. I mean, it was England before, but now it's Brexit. So that's one of the things. And the way in which then a government will totally ignore or neglect its museum and concentrate on private money, on tourism, and, you know, like, that's also choice, that's political choice. So that's what I say, we have to study also what is a museum. You know, not all museums are equal. What is the political economy? I mean, you have this huge architecture along the river of the Mat, you know, which is effectively within what I say of the building has to be impressive, as practically more important than the content, you know, so you can have picture of picture. I mean, so, and this is the model quite a lot that you see also in the global south. The building has to, you know, like amazing, as we say, and with a star architect and so on. But within it, practically nothing, but that does not matter. It does not matter much. And the shop will be more important and the restaurant will be more important. So that's also a choice, a political choice by government. And so we have, what I say, we have to study that. The museum is not a neutral place. It's not, well, so British Museum, Le Louvre, Prado, or Humboldt Museum are incredibly protected, and in the north of America, the Met, or, you know, the MoMA. So you have places, but then there are a lot of small museums in Ohio or whatever, or Nebraska are totally forgotten, and it doesn't matter, and they are totally abandoned. I visited some museums, and they're not being, you know, like renovated for the last 30 years. So this is why, again, I will say. And then I will say, for instance, for me, I mean, there is one thing in Lisbon that I think should really be destroyed, is the Belém monument. I mean, like, I cannot believe it's still there. This is an insult to so many people in the world. And first, is everything, it's like so about war. I mean, it's like so much about violence. I mean, it's a monument to violence in the middle of a city. It's something that, for the Portuguese also, it's something about domination and power of the church, because I think there's a church, the army, and the monarchy. Or the monarchy there, and then we move. It's incredible. And first, and also the question of the monumental, you know, and that also, we have also to, for me also imagining something else is like get rid of the monumental. Really get rid of the monumental. This, you know, like, because even I see in the Global South, you have to build big museum like in the West, because why should we have smaller one? We should have also big one, blah, blah, blah. It's like, why? Why? So that the monumental also have to be. So I will say that Portugal should start to get down these things, and that will be a very important thing, I think, because it will perhaps trigger some reflection. And then effectively, what do you do with what you have and the collection, and that are being put aside, as you say? And that may be a reflection. What should we keep? How do, you know, should we keep everything? Or there are these things we can sell, you know, they get some money for the, you know, other project. Because there is a total taboo on selling collection. Only the director say, okay, we will sell this or buy this, but you know, why is not the people involved in the conversation? You know, and but all this, we can get rid of it. Why do we need like so many, you know, things of the monarchy? You know, like at one point, you know, what do we really care? I mean, keep one or two, but it's that sacralization that we can. I was in Plymouth, in the city, you know, from where the pilgrim went to the United States and discovered the United States. I mean, they settled. And it's a city with a lot of migrants, and they have a museum with a lot of things which were brought back by settlers, British settlers, but from late, even, you know, 20th century, coming back from India or Kenya, whatever. It's full of objects that are like not very interesting, not necessarily beautifully, I mean, like, but accumulation. And there was a debate, and people were asked what to do with this collection. We don't know how to show it. A lot of it, you know, cannot be shown. So we are like kind of like, there are too many, you know, like, so it's kind of accumulation. And I said, but why don't you sell them? Sell the whole collection and give the money to the migrant collective, you know? And empty that place. It's the place, I mean, the way also we conceive museum is as if nothing can move. There is an accumulation that if you touch is like you are you know, it's blasphemous. Why? Why? Do we keep everything to our house? I mean, do we keep something that were given by the great-great-great-great-grandmother, and it's like something, like at one point you don't have a place for it, and it's not that nice, and it's, you know. So there is also a relation to private property and to heritage that is very patriarchal also. I mean, there are cultures where objects are buried, discarded with, you know. That's very Western, the thing. As you do know, for instance, in Japan, they will rebuild museum regularly, exactly as they were done in 11th century, absolutely exactly. So you think that you're visiting a temple for 11th century, and it was done in 2022. But so the relation to what is built is not necessarily the Western one, you know. And there were also native Inuit people in Canada, in Vancouver, that they said to the museum, by taking their object, you know, like either buying them dishonestly or whatever, but they fix an aesthetic. And the people could have done something else. You know, that. So this object become fixed in history and aesthetically, whereas they could have imagined something. I mean, they could have, or perhaps, but differently. But there is something that the museum represent the true thing, the true object, and that kind of also restrain imagination or the possibility. So it's a way it gets caught into the past, you know, the West. And this is what I say. We have really not to forget that Africa continued to create, even though 90% of the heritage was taken to the West. They never stopped. They were even able to redo what, you know, their ancestors had done. You have to open some space, you know. So certainly there is something to think about in Portugal, what kind of museum you want today. But today, to say what, to show what, to talk about what.
Thank you. I actually have two questions. One is, when I was reading your last book, I became very interested on the occupation of the museum that happened in Paris. I've tried to contact the union that was supporting the workers, but they don't have, I asked them if they had like visual archives from this happening, and they said that they don't have any. So I was wondering if where can I know more about this history? Where should I look, if you could help me with this? And the second question speaks a little bit to what was just said now, that maybe if you would somehow frame what the Macu collective in Brazil and what KTPC in Congo do as somehow an exercise to decolonize the museum, because they are basically working with art and buying land and creating something that serves directly their community. So would that be an exercise of decolonizing a museum?
All right, thank you. Yeah, the occupation in Paris, I mean, they were saying that at the time, people were not as obsessed with taking picture. A lot of things, we did not take picture. I mean, I say we because, you know, I participated also. I remember in occupation, there was not one picture. It's just my word. I can, you know, we did not take picture. We were more caught into the action than in recording it. That first thing. And even though you did not have smartphone, but you had camera, everyone had camera, so that was not one. So there are 2 or 3 pictures of that occupation, but not that many. Not that many. So the archive will be some of the the text by the union, or some interview, but very little. In fact, there is very little. But that means that also the work that has to be done with a lot of things like that, in which you have just fragment. You will have 2 pictures, 3 texts, and and the witness will have. It would be very difficult to find them. Some will have disappeared, or they will be dead, or they will not want to talk about it for different reasons. So we are confronted with that, and that is part of the work we have to do also, because this is also, we have nonetheless to work with that, with the fact that you will have just fragment. But that does not mean that the occupation did not exist. So we have to, there is Sadie Hartman who talk, about, how do you say it in English? Sadie Hartman about creative... Critical fabulation. Comment tu dis? Critical fabulation in English. And which means that she works with fragment, and nonetheless from this fragment, she is able to nonetheless, because the book, one of the book is about, young black women coming to New York, escaping poverty, and living there with, like freedom and free sexuality and so on. And they did not write their biography or whatever, but they are fragmented, and she can talk about the place where they went dancing, and this has existed. She can find, so you can reconstitute like that different thing. So with that, for instance, why was the museum occupied? Because what is interesting, as I say, is a museum about the history of people who occupy the place, but they cannot be there. The object can be there, but not there. So the body have to be expelled, so the museum can open. So that's also, also, because when you tell the story, what is also the story of that museum? What is a space? Why in the former Museum of Colony, you have now the Museum of National Immigration in France? They could not find another place. Oh, and of course, so that's, I mean, everything that has been done all over the place, as not just in the global south, but some also in the north, in the global north. Because there is also pocket of the south. If we take, in terms of politics and economy, you have pocket of the south in the north. Oh, incredible. So anyway, of course, you have invention of decolonial practice. But when we say decolonize the museum, we again use that term, the museum, as if there is something we already know what it is. I mean, it's something that, and again, there is no the museum. I mean, there is the museum, but it's the Western Universal Museum. So we could say decolonize, collection, decolonize practices, but again as a process, and through that, yeah. But we have to be careful every time we say decolonize the museum, because we talk about an institution that nonetheless is a very specific space and an institution. So it's new way of representing, new way of telling a story, or not necessarily new, but different way, using storytelling, using performance, using puppets, whatever, and effectively, constantly offering counter-narrative and counter-image. And as I say, the process of, the realization of production of counter-image and counter-narrative has a long history. A long history. It does not start with us, And so it's also, in that long history, it's important to look at what people did before, And in Europe, carnival, by peasantry, we are a form of that, or different charivari, as we say, So we have also to pay attention and not get absorbed by the, like rabbit in the light, of the museum,
Hello. I study museology, and I'm doing a thesis on about an exhibition that deals with problematic photographies taken in Angola during the 50s and the 60s, when Angola was still a colony, a Portuguese colony. And this exhibition uses a practice that it's common nowadays in museums, that is to call artists from the diaspora and ask them to reappropriate and resignify the object. Mm-hmm. I feel like it's a good idea, but I'm afraid that it became kind of like a tendency or a model, a trend that is not that genuine. And I also feel like it's also this obsession that museums have to resignify the objects and to make a reconciliation with a past that I feel like it's not an object of reconciliation. And I feel like it comes more of a place of guilt rather than really trying to decolonize the institution. And my question is, am I being too negative? Or is it a valid point of view?
No, I think it's a very important remark. I mean, I know that, for instance, I mean, there is also a tendency when there is a difficulty to call for the artist to resolve that difficulty. And for instance, in the Africa Museum in Belgium, they had to say something about Lumumba and the assassination of Lumumba. You know, could not talk about the Congo. And so rather than, the Belgium, okay, we have to talk about it, but how to talk about it without talking about it, right? So they ask a contemporary artist to do something. And so you see, Antonio, comment dit Antonio? A barrel, right? A barrel, you know, because he was, his body was, and they tried to dissolve it, right? So there is that, and you have chains with it and so on, and it's half cut or whatever. I mean, and you walk by it. If you don't know you just see a barrel being cut with some chains. You don't get it, you know. And so, of course, on the side there is something about Lumumba, whatever, but there is no things, you know, like there is no. It's certain. I mean, it's done in a way that it should not trigger anger. Or you know, it should not. It should just information. Lumumba was assassinated, so perhaps it's not very good, but you know, it's nothing. You know, it's certainly not a crime that has never been you know, punished, and that the state, or you know, the Belgian state is still responsible for that assassination. So effectively, contemporary artists can be called to because there is a difficulty. And rather than confronting that difficulty, you know, and you will say, oh, but it was a contemporary artist from Congo, you know, or whatever. So what can you say, you know? So yeah, that's. I don't think you're being negative. And then the second point, you say that, you know, it has the museum take this task to. Re-signify, but also to propose a new narrative from the museum, which is an institution which nonetheless has its own problem, right? And so that effectively, again, change something, so nothing changed, you know. So you change, but nothing really changed. And it's a big question, is because it has to do effectively with a show, like you say, or something like in Brussels. That you have to put something, you know, like you have to say something, but you save nonetheless the institution. The institution has done its job, right? They have talked about it. You cannot say you did not talk about it. Let's talk about it, but in a way that, you know, it's a way. It's like when I visit Museum of Slavery, it's done in a way that to tell you it was bad, which is at least, you know. Yes, that's the minimum. But you don't leave it enraged. The museum don't want you to leave and join a collective against racism or against the war, you know. They want you to have some moral, you know, indignation, you know, that was bad, but you know, you're not gonna say, oh my God, I'm gonna call, you know, where's the collective? Where is the anti-racist collective that I can join, you know? And when do we occupy the museum, you know? No. And when I visited the Museum of Apartheid in Johannesburg, that was that, you know, it was very important to have this museum. And you know the story of the Museum of Apartheid? So they did not have money, but they have to have a Museum of Apartheid. So a guy say, okay, I can give you the money, but that's the condition. There is a big space nearby, near Joburg. So on one side, I built a casino. And then there is a parking, and the Museum of Apartheid would be there. Fine, okay. So you arrive, you can go to the casino or to the museum or to both. But the Museum of Apartheid is connected to what you say. The entry to the museum is colored and white. And supposedly, you're going to experience by entering the only white or only colored something of what was reported. And when you buy the ticket, they look at you, and if you're black, you will enter to the white only. And if you are non-white, you understand what I mean. As if this will make you experience something, you know. And then the thing get you, because the reported state film a lot and took a lot of picture of what they were doing, you know, the operation. So you have a lot of image and film about, so it's quite impressive. But it end up with the Rainbow Nation. It has to end positively. It's like Slavery Museum. They have to end positively, you know. So there is nothing that what is about today. There is no present. It's always, it's constantly something has been, you know, has been find some hand or some closure, as we say today. But yes, I will say it's a very problematic thing. Some artists are able to do something interesting, but it's more what you say about the fact that the museum was practically automatically turned to this. Rather than, it's not necessarily what the artist has done, perhaps it's interesting or perhaps not, but whatever, but it's more what you say, that the museum will do that practically to avoid wondering what can we do with that and how this can be in a museum, which is quite difficult. Most museum is really like trying to, flatten thing. Even when they show crimes. It's also difficult to show that. So perhaps also is it really something that should be automatic to build, you know, to have museum on apartheid, museum on, you know, crime against humanity? Is it really, you know, is it the place? Is it the place? That become practically, you know, like a law, right? As soon as there's been something, you have to have a museum. You have to wonder also why. Is it the best place for that? Or is it a place where you will have film, debates, constantly, like a constant, renewed conversation, rather than having, you know, something that, I wonder, because I don't know, I visited a lot of places about, you know, crimes, and you wonder. And there are ways of sometimes, like in Buenos Aires, this place where it's not far from the army place where they were killing and torturing people and where they are throwing people in the sea. And it's not through the museum they did it. It's through a kind of itinerary by the sea. So you have to wonder, is the museum really the institution that will answer this question? There is a tendency, and I'm not sure it's always right.
Thank you.
Mais partilhas ou ideias? Quem quer contribuir? Não há mais ideias? Não? Lá atrás? Muito bem, então. Às vezes é timidez, não é?
Thank you so much, Professor Vergès, for coming. You've been an inspiration for so long. It's a pleasure to see you in person and listen to you out of your books. So my question, I'll make my question the position of someone from the diaspora, so that travels in between the two worlds, the global south, and being mentally shaped by the Western globalized dominant perspective, even in the culture. And what I've been lately been struggling with is exactly how to dismantle this mental colonization that was built in our socialization, and how it shapes the way we try to decolonize at the same way. And my question is, how do we navigate in between this, what I would portray as a field of trying to escape the trickies, all the tricks that mental colonization shaped ourselves as individuals, even in individuals that are in the perspective of decolonization, of decolonizing and dismantling this system and this model that was built upon our bodies and our minds.
Yeah. I mean, when you read either, Albert Memmi, Frantz Fanon, Aimé Césaire, but even you read also feminists and so on. I mean, for women to get rid of patriarchy and all the, what has been put in our mind, or, colonize, like black skin, white mask, what that, and the incredible difficulty that it's not automatic. It's not because you want to get, rid of that it's going to happen like that. Because effectively, it's not only what was put in your mind, as a child at school, but it's a constant production. There is a daily production, movies, TV, media, schools, surrounding. It's a constant production of image, and that constantly, because the power cannot just one day say, this was that, and, and no longer produce. Have a production of image and idea and text that will nourish that, because it's being contested. So when the contestation, how to answer that contestation? So you can criminalize people and say, oh, these are terrible communists or Islamo-leftists or whatever. But nonetheless, it's not enough. You have also to provide new, for instance, still the old ways, but with new words or new images, and provide, like effectively something that, in a way, so either you remain within your opinion, or it's offer you a way of pacifying it, like, okay, it's terrible, but it's also about people. They don't do what they should be doing, okay, Africa is better, but it's not also about because of African, they could have done otherwise. So, it provides also, reasoning and things for you to, in fact, well, things are like that also, like, it's difficult to change, what can you do? People, people don't want, so it's constantly people, I mean, you don't know who are these people, but there are some people, like there is an existence of people in the world. You don't know really where they come from, their language, whatever, but they don't want, right? They don't want. And so usually because you will be doing it, but people don't want, right? So it's a constant production of, like effectively, I'm not responsible, I'm not effectively, but again, what can I do by myself? Like, what can I do? And so also, not making you think that constantly you cannot do it alone, that for sure. Even your own decolonization, not going to be done by yourself. I mean, there is no individual, like power like that, and suddenly, you're going to get rid of it. So it's a collective work. It's also, as I say, constant curiosity, learning. You have to learn. You have to learn. You have to educate yourself and educate yourself with others. Because there are a lot of things that we're not told, we're not taught. And so it's quite, in fact, it's more exciting than depressing, because suddenly the world open and there are a lot of things, and then you learn how things are fabricated. So it's not like a mystery, it's not like some kind of unknown power, like doing that. No, these are people. You can identify them, and this is what it works. So It's a constant work on how consent is being fabricated, and also how dissent is being fabricated. You know, it is emerge. The consent being fabricated, I was also very interested because, as I say, I work on colonial slavery, and I had to understand why it lasted 4 centuries, even though it was contested from the beginning by the enslaved themselves, by the captive, and, you know, it was, and even in Europe, by European, and it lasted 4 centuries. And there was not a year without an insurrection, without a rebellion, without, you know, like people. There was not, you know, women killing their children rather than they become slave, people on the way of the trade route, people escaping, people rather killing themselves than, you know, getting on the boat. Constant contestation, and it lasted. So how consent was fabricated? How consent is fabricated something that nonetheless, you know, is not normal, whatever normal means, but it works. So that is very important, because then you understand how you can join, you know, dissent, and how you can, and why, in fact, that consent cannot be. You know, because consent is really in that, I'm not talking about violence and so on, but I'm talking political violence, is nonetheless, and it's also how you build, again, indifference. I mean, you know, it's what you see during war, whatever, that life will go on. Life goes on, you know? And this is at both amazing, and it's part of the incredible strength of the human, you know, like life will not stop. Life will not stop. But at the same time, is life will not stop built on indifference or being on the desire to live. You know, like, no, we will not be, you know, beaten into not living. So you have constantly to assess. I would say that one of the practice of decolonization is to have joy, because, oh my God, this guy do not love that. Oh my God, look at their face anyway, you know, look at their face. I mean, these are mean people. These are mean people. And so having joy is really it's form of resistance. Also, sometimes we imagine too big things is nourishing friendship. Enjoying things, you know, like really also living really in freedom. So constantly carving space of freedom in a world of unfreedom. The world is built on unfreedom, and carving constantly space of freedom. So the decolonization is not like something like going to happen, like some revelation one day, oh, here it is, I'm decolonized, you know. It's a constant process also. And also listening to friends who tell you, girl, that's not it, you know. And yeah, it's work. But as I say, it will not happen like that, because there's constant production of things, you know. I mean, the women's movement have been there for like decades and decades, if not century, and then we hear still, you know, incredible thing. So long struggle. Long, difficult, and full of joy. Absolutely full of joy.
And I want to, before an ovation, to thank Francoise Vergès for this wonderful lecture. I would invite you to come again to this room the 28th April. We will receive a wonderful artist from Angola and Portuguese, that is Francisco Vidal, that has a show in this moment on the other side of Campo Grande Garden, in Pavilhão Transparente, produced by the Galerias Municipais de Lisboa. So he'll be with us the 28th April at 6 p.m. Okay, in this room, free entrance, please come back again. I think there are many links with this lecture of Francoise Vergès, because it's an
fantastic show.
Afro-Portuguese artist. We visit this
fantastic show
together, and thank you, Francoise. And now an ovation to Francoise Vergès, and thank you very much.